Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Adam Varenhorst. I am the Extension Field Crop Entomologist at South Dakota State University. One of the insects that we maybe don't think about during the season, but that can be an issue both in the field as well as in the stored grain, are weevils. Now, there's actually two species of weevils that we watch for in wheat. The first is the rice weevil, and the second is the maize weevil. Now, you may be thinking, well, if they're a stored grain pest, why are they an issue in the field? And it isn't that they are so much feeding on the grain in the field. However, a lot of times these pests can show up in the field, and that can help transport them into the storage areas. So our first pest, the rice weevil, is going to be small. Both weevil species are going to be quite small, and you will have to actually be searching for them a little bit. It has a shorter snout than the other weevil species. The adults and the larvae will both be feeding on the wheat, so they will be causing deterioration of the grain. One of the important notes is that the rice weevils are not strong flyers. So if we're thinking about pests that may be moving into the field, it's probably not the rice weevils. When these are in a bin or a stored grain facility, they need high moisture content in the grain. Their life cycle literally requires it. And so if grain is dried or is at the right condition when it's stored, it reduces the risk of having this pest take off and cause a severe infestation. On the converse of that, though, if we have a bad infestation of this pest, it means that you have a very humid environment in your storage area, around 70% relative humidity. And so that means maybe we need to work on getting some air movement into that grain to reduce the humidity. The other species is the maize weevil. These are also very small with a short snout. The adults and the larvae feed, so this sounds very similar to the rice weevil, with the exception of these are actually very strong flyers. And so that means that these can move into fields. And we've had reports in South Dakota of weevil species showing up near harvest in the field and then having infested grain afterwards. And so that's something we really watch for to try to prevent that. So what can you do for weevil management? One of the difficulties is that there aren't a lot of insecticides labeled for weevil management that late in the season. So if these are showing up really close to harvest in the field, there isn't really a chemical that you can spray to reduce their populations without also increasing the time to harvest, because insecticides have that pre-harvest interval, and it's important to make sure that we don't harvest before that period is up. So some options we have after harvest to make sure we can reduce our stored grain issues are to, one, if possible, use a grain cleaner. Now, I know that this is not the most popular option because using a grain cleaner means you're slowing up the entire process during harvest. So, although very effective and very good at removing the weevils from the grain, it does slow things down. The other option is to do a pre-bin treatment of your storage area. Now, this means that you need to go through, especially for a bin, clean it out, and this means get rid of any dust. If possible, remove the flooring, vacuum any dust out with a shop vac or sweep. The whole purpose, though, is to try to really make sure you have a clean surface. Once you do that, then you can come in with either a malathion or another pre-binning treatment. Make sure the label says pre-binning so that you can use it safely. And then the labels will also provide information regarding how high up the bin you can apply that treatment and what safety equipment you need to be wearing during the treatment. Another option that may be more popular is the protectant insecticide application. And the reason these are popular is that they can actually be applied as the grain is being augured into the bin. And so once that protectant insecticide is applied at the correct rate, that grain is theoretically protected for the efficacy period of that insecticide. Now, there are also other options, including top dressing. However, the issues with some of these is if we bin as we were putting the grain into the bin, If the insects were already present, they'll be spread throughout. And so it's not so much of an issue of just getting the insecticide on the top layer. We need that insecticide to be effective somewhat throughout. So our next group of pests are cutworms. And so these are an early season issue in wheat. And the two species that we really watch for are the army cutworm and the pale western cutworm. I should mention that both of these species are more of an issue as we head west. So in South Dakota, that's when we get near to or cross the Missouri River. So if you look on a map, if you are east of that area, you may not have an issue with this pest or either of these. The big difference between the two, as their name implies, is the pale western cutworm is rather pale, while the army cutworm can have some variation in its color. For the army cutworm, this pest actually hatches in winter wheat and alfalfa fields in the fall. That means that the moths are looking for those green fields late summer and early fall, and they're laying the eggs there. Once the caterpillars hatch, they will feed a little bit during the fall until conditions force them to prepare and overwinter, and they'll actually stay in that field as the caterpillars. This allows them to actually start feeding very early in the spring. And as a result, if you have a large populations of army cutworm in the field, you can start seeing some very early feeding injury as well as stand reduction. These pests can actually cause a lot of feeding issues on the stands, and as a result, if you have a large population, as I mentioned, you can see stand losses. However, one of the big differences between this and our pale western cutworm is that the army cutworm are pretty much only feeding on the foliage and the leaves, and as a result, if we treat in time, we can save those stands. And why I say that's so different is the pale western cutworm feeds on a different part of the plant. The pale western cutworms overwinter as eggs in the soil, and then they hatch as caterpillars in the spring. And the caterpillars actually feed almost exclusively underground. So if we think about the difference there, the army cutworms are feeding on the leaves, where the pale western cutworms are actually going to be feeding more on the stem. And because the pale western cutworms are showing up a little bit later in the season, sometimes these are more of an issue in emerging spring wheat. The big problem with the pale western cutworms is that their feeding actually kills the plant because it's feeding right at that growing point, and when it does so, the plant is done. And so if you have a large population of these, they reduce the stand, and unlike the army cutworm, we can't go in with a rescue application of insecticide and remove their populations. So it's important to scout early and make sure if you are starting to see any issues with this, you can treat and make sure you stay ahead of the major stand losses. The thresholds for these two pests are 2 to 4 for the army cutworm. That's 2 to 4 army cutworm caterpillars per square foot. And so that means you have to be out in the field, and we don't expect you to take a frame out that's exactly a square foot. You can estimate a little bit, but 2 to 4 army cutworm caterpillars per square foot is the threshold, and then 1 to 2 pale western cutworm caterpillars per square foot. And the reason the pale western cutworm threshold is lower is because, as I mentioned, once they start feeding, those plants can't be rescued. And so we need to make sure we're staying on top of that pest. For both pests, there is the possibility, especially for the pale western cutworm though, that you will need to have a trowel or a small shovel so that you can actually dig around injured or dying plants to see if you can find the cutworm caterpillars. These will be somewhat under the soil in both cases, so make sure you have the proper equipment for digging. To manage these pests, pyrethroid insecticides are often the selected tool because they can be very effective. And for these insecticides, or any that are selected, they should be applied in the evening as these pests are nocturnal feeders. We're now going to transition from caterpillars to aphids. And for wheat, there are a few species of aphids that can cause problems. We're going to focus on 3 of them. The first is the bird chariot aphid. Now, these are very easy to identify in the field because they are a dark olive green color, And then they have a burnt red patch that you can see there near the end of their abdomens. So if you are familiar with aphids, they have those little tubes that we often call tailpipes. They're cornicles. And right around the cornicles on these will be that burnt red or orange patch. And typically it stands out very clearly when you're scouting the fields and see these aphids. Bird chariot aphids migrate to wheat late in the spring to early summer. So that's when it's important to start scouting. One of the things these pests can do is vector barley yellow dwarf virus. However, if we also get very large populations of them feeding, they can reduce yields just through the large populations feeding on the plants. The next aphid species is the English grain aphid. Now these are yellow-green and they'll have a dark pattern on their appendages. That is, if you notice here, it kind of alternates from light colored to dark colored, and typically the joints on the legs are going to be dark colors. These also have dark tailpipes or cornicles, so typically they're black in color, and the antenna will have a variation of coloration as well, typically light to dark. As you can see, it's a little bit visible on this picture, however, the antenna weren't in focus. These typically will colonize developing heads on the wheat. And so that helps for scouting because you can start there. And then if you don't see them and you see another species of aphid, chances are it's not the English grain aphid. These also can vector barley yellow dwarf virus. But like the bird chariot aphid, if we get large enough populations out in the field, they can also reduce yields just through all that feeding pressure. Now, the last aphid species is the green bug. This is also a vector of barley yellow dwarf virus. These also can reduce yield through direct feeding, but what's different from them, from the other species, is that they feed, and when they do that, they cause discoloration to start forming on the leaves due to their saliva. And so if we look, they get their names because they're green. They're typically a bright green to almost yellow color. They're going to be fairly small. But if you look at the picture here with the leaf, you see those brown spots. That's that discoloration I mentioned. So that's how you can tell whether you have a green bug or not if you aren't sure. So for these aphids, the best way to scout for them is to walk in a zigzag pattern and examine the plants. Typically, we recommend examining plants on each of the legs, so 5 to 10 plants. And in wheat, it does take a little bit longer because for bird chariot aphids, they can be on the leaves. And then I should also mention with bird chariot aphids, they have a defense mechanism where they will actually drop off the plant when you disturb it. And so it can also make it tough to get an exact population estimate. So how do we manage these aphids? Well, the first thing we can do is try to prevent green bridges from occurring in the field. That is, don't have volunteer wheat or other grass hosts near the field that you're planting. Delaying planting can also help in reducing the infestations. For winter wheat, we often recommend using seed treatments because since we know the aphids are going to be targeting those plants as soon as they start emerging, those treatments can still be very effective and reduce the infestations. If a large population is detected, foliar insecticides can be used to reduce the populations. And here I have a table showing the different thresholds for each species. And so I want you to note that we have the different life stages of the wheat here. And then if you notice, often the number of aphids for the threshold varies by that life stage. So some life stages need to be scouted a little bit more closely for aphid pressure than others. But you should always be out scouting to make sure that the pest doesn't catch you unaware. So for bird chariot aphid, it's 20 aphids at the seedling stage, 30 for the English grain aphid, and 5 to 15 for the green bug. The boot to heading stage is 30 aphids for bird chariot, 50 for the English grain aphid, and 25 for the green bug. For the flowering stage, it's 5 or more bird chariot aphids, 5 English grain aphids, and more than 25 for the green bug. For the milky ripe stage, for the bird cherry oat is 10 aphids per plant. The English grain aphid is 10 aphids per plant, and the green bug, again, is more than 25. The milk to medium dose stage for the bird cherry oat aphid and English grain aphid is more than 10 aphids per plant, and for the green bug, more than 25 aphids per plant. And it's important to remember that all of these numbers are averages. So when you look at all of the plants, you calculate the average number of aphids per plant, and that's how you determine if you're at the threshold or not. Our next pest is the true armyworm. Now, unlike some of our other pests that we've talked about, these actually have to migrate from the southern US into the wheat fields each year. And these can be identified based on several characteristics. One of the things we look at right away is the number of legs they have. So all caterpillars will have 3 pairs of true legs, which are near their head. They will also then have different numbers of abdominal prolegs, and those are those legs that you see there in the middle of its body. For the true armyworm, they will have 4 pairs of prolegs, like you see in the picture. Some other characteristics we look for, if we stay focused on those abdominal prolegs, is the dark band you can see. So it's we can see their feet, which are a light orange color, then there's the black band, and then their gray body. And so that's one characteristic. Another characteristic that's important to search for is that yellow stripe that we see running down the side of their body. They actually have that on both sides. Now, the issue with the coloration as an identification quality is that characteristic is that they can vary quite a bit in color. If we look at the picture up on the top of the screen, those are both true armyworm caterpillars, and they're actually from the same field. But you'll notice one's the kind of dark green, almost black coloration with the orange stripe, and the other one's almost a tan color, but still has the orange stripe. So we can't really use body coloration other than that stripe for identification. And the last characteristic that we look for is the network of black lines present on their head. And you can see that in that bottom picture of the caterpillar on the corn plant. It almost looks like somebody took an ink pen and started squiggling lines on their head. And so not all caterpillars will have that pattern. And so that can be useful for identifying them. True armyworm can be a pest of many different crops. They can be an issue in corn, but in wheat, they can also be a major issue. They'll feed on the leaves of any type of grassy plant, including the wheat. And when they do so, they can remove all of the leaf material. They also, once the leaves are all gone, will start moving up the plant because they're still looking for resources. And most of our yield loss with this pest occurs when they destroy the flag leaf or later in the season when they clip the heads. And so here's a picture of the true armyworm actually feeding on the head. And so that can be a major issue. I've seen fields where these can remove several acres to somewhere in the ballpark of 40 to 60 acres. So it's very important to stay on top of scouting. These pests typically arrive when we're getting closer to harvest. And so it's something to watch for. Now, of course, as you move south in the country, these will show up earlier in the season because they don't have to move as far from where they overwinter. For true armyworm management, it's very important to start scouting early and use visual counts or sweep nets. We typically stop using sweep nets once the heads are forming because we don't want to do any yield loss beyond what we might just with the visual counts as walking through the field. The threshold for true armyworms is either 2 caterpillars per square yard or approximately 40 caterpillars per 30 pendulum swings with a sweep net. Now, once you see the caterpillars, if they're really late in the season, you may need to be careful in your insecticide selection. And so I don't recommend that you have to choose one or the other of these products. I just chose these products based on their pre-harvest interval. And so Bolton has a 7-day pre-harvest interval, and Coragen or Prevothin both have a 1-day pre-harvest interval. These are typically very popular when the populations of the true armyworm are showing up later in the season, or when a lot of the feeding's being detected right around harvest. As I mentioned before, it's very important to often not delay that harvest, because if you do with an insecticide application, you're then at the mercy of the weather for the next few days, or how many days it is until that interval's up. And so it's often important to make sure you can harvest as soon as possible. And I should also mention that if you've never seen it, true armyworms get their name because when very large populations are present, they a lot of times almost look like a little army marching through the field. And there have also been reports of these marching across roads to get from one field to the next. And so it's something, when a very large population is present, chances are you'll notice it. Now, our next pests are grasshoppers. And this is something that we really watch for closely, both in the fall, but also in the spring for our wheat. There are several species of grasshoppers that are capable of causing major defoliation problems for wheat production. Most of the time, grasshopper populations are going to be more of an issue around the field, so the field margins. And the reason for that is these insects have to move from somewhere to get into the field. Grasshoppers tend to start in the road ditches, grass waterways, anywhere that there was grass. And the reason they move into the field eventually is because that grass that they were feeding on begins to dry down, and then they start searching for green hosts for food sources. And so a lot of times in the fall, our emerging winter wheat can be really targeted by large grasshopper populations because they built up all summer. And then whatever they were feeding on begins to turn brown as the season progresses. And that winter wheat starts to emerge and it looks great. It's essentially a grasshopper buffet because it's young, succulent plants that are still green and full of nutrients. And so the grasshoppers move very quickly into that. For grasshoppers, the threshold is 11 to 20 grasshoppers per square yard. Now, if you want to really split hairs, the number is a little bit higher for nymphs and a little bit lower for the adults. But typically when we're seeing these in the winter wheat, they're all adults, so the 11 to 20 works for us. Foliar insecticides will reduce their populations. However, I should have an asterisk here because you have to use the recommended rate. If the label has it for grasshoppers, make sure you use that. And if it doesn't, make sure you're using the higher end of the labeled rate. Don't go with the lower end of the labeled rate, because if you're having adult grasshoppers causing issues, the lower end of that rate may not reduce their populations. Adult grasshoppers are pretty tough, and so we have to make sure we get enough insecticide on them to reduce their populations. For the winter wheat, insecticide seed treatments can have some deterrence effect on the grasshopper populations. However, if they're adults, we aren't actually killing them. We're more or less just making them want to search for something else to eat. Another option we recommend for grasshopper management that doesn't require insecticide products is to plant a higher population density for the wheat right around the field. So a couple passes around the field at a higher density. And the reason for that is that higher planting population can actually allow you to tolerate a little bit of grasshopper feeding. And so even if the grasshoppers do move in, they often stop at the edges of the field. And if you have more plants at the edge of the field and they eat some, you'll be able to tolerate some losses. And so I put a note here, as we're looking a little bit drier than normal heading into the spring, it's going to be important to monitor closely for grasshopper populations. Typically, grasshoppers are worse when we get into dry years. Part of that's because they don't have as much food available. Another thing is that we had a really nice fall in 2020. That allowed the grasshoppers to have a longer egg-laying period. If we don't get a lot of moisture in the spring, we're not going to see natural mortality of the grasshoppers as they're preparing to emerge. Sometimes we can drown grasshoppers out to an extent to reduce the populations a little bit if we get a lot of rain. However, if we have a dry spring, and we already know we had a pretty warm fall, we could have increased grasshopper populations. So monitor for those as you go into the season. Now, the next pest isn't an insect, but it's a relative of an insect. And so I'll mention it here, and it's the wheat crow mite. Now, these are very small. I even need a hand lens to see these, so it's my recommendation. Some people can spot these. They're very hard. They're very small, so they're very hard to see with the naked eye. If you have a hand lens or some sort of magnification device, I recommend it if you're trying to determine if you have wheat crow mite. The adults are actually carried on the wind, and that's how they move from field to field. They overwinter on green plant material. And then the big thing we have here is that once they get on those plants, they overwinter, they start emerging and feeding, and then the wind will carry the adults. And so if we have plants that are green in our fields that we're preparing to plant to spring wheat, or in the fall to winter wheat, we're establishing a nice green bridge. And remember that green bridge is having volunteer plants available, or hosts, so weeds, volunteer wheat, available as a host for these pests. And then once we plant the field, if we don't remove those volunteers, the insects or the mites, for example, can move directly into our crop. Now, another option for wheat crow mite is delayed planting. If you notice here, there are no insecticide products because they just aren't very effective against wheat crow mite. And so the big issue is that these vector a virus, and I won't take away from plant pathologists, but the virus can be very detrimental and cause a lot of issues in the field. Now, this next relative of insects is something that we typically don't see. We saw, though, a little bit in 2020 because in areas of South Dakota, we had a lot of precipitation in the spring, and we had a lot of issues with slugs. Now, that's unusual for us, but it is something that's important to remember, that slugs can be a problem. They require cool, wet spring conditions, and they're typically more of an issue in fields with high crop residues. We have a lot of no-till fields, and so we essentially had the recipe for disaster during the spring of 2020 with the slugs. And so they typically are very early season if they're going to be a problem. And then as the season progresses and the plants grow and the fields dry out a little bit, we don't really notice the slugs then. And they actually will scrape the foliage. And as you can see here in the picture, they can cause stand reductions if they're feeding on the plants, as this one was, and actually causing them to lodge. You can also have issues where early season, before the seeds actually germinate and grow, slugs will feed on them and can reduce stands that way as well. So it is an unusual thing to have to worry about, but maybe not this spring, but something to continue monitoring for during the spring. And the last pest I have is a relatively minor pest. And the reason I put it in here is that we observe this a lot in South Dakota. It's never really a major yield factor in terms of reducing yields, but it does cause a lot of concern because, as you can see in the picture here, if you have bleach heads when the rest of the field is green, you know something's wrong. And so wheat stem maggots, the flies will lay the eggs and the larvae will feed in the stem. And when they do so, they feed around the stem, and that causes the plant to stop sending nutrients up to the head, and in turn, it will turn white and bleach. So if you have wheat stem maggot in your field, the easiest way to tell it between wheat scab, because wheat scab will also cause the heads to bleach, is wheat stem maggots, because they feed around the stem. The head won't fall out, but if you walk up to it and get a little pull on that bleached head, if it comes out without a lot of resistance, that's wheat stem maggot. If you end up pulling the entire plant out of the ground when you're pulling, then that's wheat scab. And so, as I mentioned, these don't cause a lot of yield loss for us. However, it is something that when you're scouting in July and you see all these white heads in the field, you can be a little bit concerned. But so far, we've never really seen yield loss associated with these. So that's all I have. And I'd like to thank you again for your time. And if you have any questions regarding wheat, please feel free to either give me a call or an email. And again, thank you.